Watergate. What Nixon really knew. Washington, D.C., 1972-1974, August 1974. For the first and only time in United States history, a president resigned from office. What led an American president to that moment, to that helicopter, to that farewell, is one of the most studied, debated, and still, 50 years later, most relevant stories in American political history. Not because Nixon was the only president to commit abuses of power, but because he was the only one who was caught, and because the documents, tapes, and testimonies that brought him down revealed, with rare clarity, what power does to a man when he believes he is above any consequence. This is not the story of the break-in. It's the story of what came after. It's the story of what Nixon really knew. Watergate, what Nixon really knew. Nixon's America. The United States in 1972, a divided country. To understand Watergate, one must first understand America in 1972. It was a deeply divided country between those who saw the Vietnam War as an unnegotiable patriotic duty and those who saw it as the greatest moral failing of the generation. Between those who saw the civil rights movements as the fulfillment of American promises and those who saw them as a threat to the established order. In this fractured environment, Richard Milhous Nixon had come to the presidency in 1969 with a specific promise: to restore order, to bring stability to a country that seemed to be disintegrating before the television cameras. In November 1972, Nixon was re-elected by a historic margin, 49 out of 50 states. It was the second largest electoral victory in American history up to that point, a triumph that seemed at that moment definitive. And it was precisely this imminent triumph, this certainty of overwhelming victory, that made what happened before the elections not only criminal, but completely unnecessary. Nixon, the man behind the presidency. Richard Nixon was, by any objective measure, one of the most intelligent and experienced politicians America has ever produced. He had been a congressman, a senator, vice president for 8 years under Eisenhower, and had survived defeats that would have permanently ended any other career. But there was something about him that journalists and biographers would try to name for decades, a fundamental insecurity that coexisted explosively with boundless ambition. A man who distrusted everyone, who saw enemies everywhere, who believed that the rules that governed others did not apply to him. There is a phrase attributed to Kissinger in later private conversations that sums up something essential about Nixon. He had the instincts of a statesman and the psychology of a persecuted man. This combination, strategic vision and chronic paranoia, would produce some of the most remarkable foreign policy decisions of the Cold War. The opening to China, the détente with the Soviet Union, and it would also produce Watergate. The invasion, the creep committee, the re-election machine. The Committee for the Re-election of the President, known internally by the acronym that would eventually become ironic, CREEP, had been formed in 1971 with a simple stated purpose: to ensure Nixon's re-election in 1972. But in the hands of Attorney General John Mitchell and operatives like Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt, CREEP had developed a parallel set of activities that had nothing to do with conventional election campaigns. There was a program called Operation Gemstone, a set of plans for espionage, political sabotage, and disinformation against Nixon's adversaries. Plans with elaborate code names: Crystal, Opal, Quartz. The most ambitious of them was called Diamond, and its execution was to begin on June 17, 1972. June 17, 1972, the night of the break-in. In the early morning hours of June 17, 1972, 5 men broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex. Their objective was to repair listening devices that had been installed in a previous break-in and to photograph internal Democratic campaign documents. At 2:30 a.m., security guard Frank Wills made his routine rounds and noticed something unusual: adhesive tape covering the locks on some doors to prevent them from closing. He removed the tape. He returned later. The tape had been put back on. Wills called the police. In the next few hours, the identities of the 5 men would begin to reveal connections that made this simple burglary something of a completely different order. They all had connections to the CIA. At least one had Howard Hunt's phone number, a White House operative, in his contact list. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the reporters. On the morning of June 18th, two reporters from the Washington Post were assigned to cover the Watergate break-in. Bob Woodward had been hired only 9 months earlier. Carl Bernstein was known in the newsroom for his brilliant writing and his tendency to turn anything into a lengthy process. Neither of them imagined that morning that they would spend the next 2 years undoing one of the biggest cover-ups in American history. Sometimes history finds its narrators by accident. The cover-up. What Nixon knew, and when he knew it. The central question of Watergate, the question that the American Senate would formalize in the most famous phrase of the hearings, was simple and devastating. What did the president know, and when did he know it? For decades, Nixon's official version remained the same. He had learned about the break-in through the press, like any ordinary citizen. He knew nothing beforehand. He had authorized nothing. The operatives who acted had acted on their own initiative. The tapes proved that this version was a lie. For decades, Nixon's official version remained the same. He had learned about the break-in through the press, like any ordinary citizen. He knew nothing beforehand. He had authorized nothing. The operatives who acted had acted on their own initiative. The tapes proved that this version was a lie. But before the tapes, there was the cover-up. And the cover-up, the active decision to obstruct the investigation, began no days after the break-in. It started hours later. On June 23, 1972, just 6 days after the break-ins, Nixon and his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, had a conversation in the Oval Office that would go down in history as the smoking cancer tape. In that conversation, Nixon instructed Haldeman to use the CIA to pressure the FBI to end the Watergate investigation, falsely claiming that the investigation would compromise national security operations. It was obstruction of justice. Documented, in the president's own words, money, the trail that doesn't lie. While Nixon was trying to control the political damage, Woodward and Bernstein were following a different path. Money. The 5 Watergate burglars had been paid. The money had passed through an account in Mexico before reaching their hands, an attempt to obscure its origin. But journalists, with the help of sources within the government who were taking real risks to speak, managed to trace the money back to its source, the creep treasury, the Committee for the Re-election of the President. More than that, there was a secret slush fund, controlled by Mitchell, that had financed not only Watergate, but the entire range of Creep's illegal political espionage operations. The thread connecting the break-in to the President's Re-election Committee was being drawn, item by item, penny by penny. Deep Throat, the informant in the dark. Woodward's most important source, identified only as Deep Throat, a code name given by the Post's editors, had agreed with the reporter on a communication system worthy of a spy novel. When Woodward needed guidance, he would move a flower pot to his apartment balcony. When Deep Throat wanted to talk, he would draw a clock on the inside pages of the reporter's newspaper. The meetings took place in an underground parking garage in the early morning hours. Deep Throat's identity would remain secret for over 30 years, until 2005, when the informant himself, Mark Felt, then 91 years old, revealed that he was the FBI's deputy director during the investigations. One of the most powerful men in the FBI had decided that the law was worth more than loyalty to the White House. The tapes. The Senate hearings, the summer of 1973. In May 1973, the U.S. Senate began public hearings on Watergate, broadcast live on television and watched by tens of millions of Americans. What the country witnessed was a succession of figures who had served in the White House dismantling, one by one, Nixon's official version. John Dean, a former White House counsel, testified that Nixon had been directly involved in the cover-up from the very beginning. Others confirmed an environment of systematic illegal operations. But it was a seemingly technical, almost bureaucratic revelation that would change everything. In July 1973, Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, was summoned to testify. Investigators expected routine questions. Then one of the investigators asked, almost by chance, if there was any recording system in the White House. Butterfield also, yes, he said. There's an automatic audio recording system installed in the Oval Office, the Cabinet Room, Nixon's office in the Executive Building, and on the telephones. The battle for the tapes, Nixon versus the world. What followed was a legal battle unprecedented in American history. The President of the United States against Congress, the Department of Justice, and the judicial system itself in a dispute over control of tapes he himself had created. Nixon refused to hand over the tapes, invoking the principle of executive privilege, the doctrine that private presidential communications are protected from congressional scrutiny. The special court created to investigate the case demanded the tapes. Nixon fired the special prosecutor who had made the request in a series of events that became known as the Saturday Night Massacre in October 1973. The public reaction was explosive. What had begun as a political scandal was turning into a constitutional crisis. And there was one tape in particular that investigators knew existed, the conversation from June 23, 1972, 6 days after the break-in, that Nixon resisted handing over more than any other. The 18.5 minutes, the silence that condemned. When Nixon finally handed over some of the tapes, under court order, investigators discovered something that Nixon's secretary, Rosemary Woods, would be called upon to explain publicly. One of the tapes, specifically a conversation from the days immediately following the break-in, had a blackout. Not a small blackout, an 18.5-minute blackout. Woods claimed to have caused it accidentally, demonstrating with photos how he had inadvertently kept the tape recorder's pedal pressed while answering the phone, a position that experts would soon point out was physically impossible to sustain for 18 minutes. 5 independent experts in forensic acoustics, appointed by the court, reached a unanimous conclusion. The deletion had been done manually, in at least 5 distinct and deliberate operations. What happened in those 18.5 minutes could never be recovered. The collapse. The summer of 1974, the impeachment process. In the summer of 1974, the House Judiciary Committee initiated formal impeachment proceedings against Richard Nixon. There were 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress. What made this moment unique in American history was not just the seriousness of the accusations. It was the fact that members of Nixon's own party, Republicans who had been close allies, who had publicly defended the president for months, began voting in favor of impeachment. For many of these congressmen, the decision had been made not out of political conviction, but for something simpler and more difficult. They had listened to the tapes. The cancer tape, the definitive proof. On August 5, 1974, the White House released transcripts of 3 conversations, including the one from June 23, 1972, which had been specifically requested by investigators. The conversation revealed, without any possible ambiguity, that Nixon had personally instructed his chief of staff, 6 days after the break-in, to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI investigation. The conversation revealed that Nixon knew about the connections between Creep and the invaders. The conversation revealed that the decision to cover up had been made at the highest level, not by subordinates acting on their own. It was the proof that Nixon had denied existed for 2 years. On the same day as the announcement, Senator Barry Goldwater, the most emblematic living American conservative who had publicly defended Nixon until then, went to the White House with other Republican leaders. Goldwater told Nixon directly, "You have no more than 15 votes in the Senate to avoid impeachment, and one of them isn't mine." The last days, the White House in collapse. The days following the release of the June 23 tape were described by those inside the White House as the darkest of the American presidency. Nixon oscillated between anger and resignation. At times, according to close aides, he spoke of fighting to the end. At other times, he would sit in silence for hours. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, concerned about the president's stability, quietly instructed the military not to obey any order to use force without his prior confirmation, an unprecedented precaution in American history. The most powerful man in the world had lost the trust of everyone around him. The resignation. August 8, 1974. The speech. On the evening of August 8, 1974, Richard Nixon sat before the television cameras in the Oval Office and did what no American president had done before, and none has done since. He resigned. The speech lasted 16 minutes. Nixon did not admit to any crimes. He did not apologize for the acts that had precipitated his downfall. He spoke of errors in judgment and the good of the country as his motivation. But there was one phrase, almost hidden in the middle of the speech, that carried the weight of the entire story. "I no longer have a strong enough political base in Congress to continue this fight." I am not saying I am innocent, but I am leaving for the good of the country. I was not saying I was unjustly persecuted. Simply put, the math has changed. I can't win anymore. August 9th, 1974, the last day. The following morning, August 9th, 1974, Nixon bid farewell to the White House staff in a speech that many described as the most revealing of his entire career, precisely because it had not been prepared. He spoke about his mother, about his father, about Teddy Roosevelt, about not hating his enemies. It was a speech by a man without a script for the first time in decades of public life. At 11:35 a.m., as Marine One rose over Washington, Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States without having been elected to the office. Ford looked at the cameras and said, "Our long national nightmare is over." What Watergate revealed was not just the corruption of one man. It revealed the limits of power. And more surprisingly, it revealed that those limits worked. A democratic system that had been subverted at its highest level. He found within himself the mechanisms to correct himself. A security guard who noticed duct tape on door locks. 2 young reporters who followed the money when others stopped. An informant within the FBI who believed the law was worth more than loyalty. Senators who voted against their own president. Judges who upheld their orders under extraordinary pressure. Watergate didn't collapse because there was a hero. It fell because there were too many, each doing just their part at the right time. The question that Watergate posed to America, what did the president know and when did he know it, was answered by the tapes. The question that Watergate poses to each subsequent generation is different and more difficult. When the institutions are tested again, and they will there be a Frank Wills noticing the tape on the door? Will there be a Woodward and a Bernstein following the money? Will there be judges who refuse to give in? The answer depends on each generation that inherits this democracy. In 1974, American institutions resisted. The question for future generations is, what now? End.